As we get started today, I wanted to tell you guys a little bit of a story that I quite enjoy. On the morning of August 7th, 1974, a Frenchman named Philippe Petit performed one of the greatest stunts in history, right in the middle of Lower Manhattan. You know, after his crew caught a lucky break the night before by getting access to a freight elevator, this French high-wire walker performed for 45 minutes on one of the most elevated stages imaginable, a 200-foot steel cable spanning the gap between the unfinished north and south towers of the World Trade Center complex. He didn't just walk either. As he got used to the conditions of his quarter-mile high stage, he also danced, knelt, laid down on this wire, as you can see in that picture. He was showing off his impeccable skills of balance to a crowd below, who were pausing during the busy hours of their morning commute. In the city that never sleeps, they stopped to take in a most good-natured act of trespassing. Now, he did get arrested for trespassing and got a very harsh sentence for his crimes. A mandated public high-wire performance in Central Park for children, and a lifetime pass to the observation decks at the Twin Towers. His story has since been captured by everything from an Academy Award-winning documentary to where I first encountered it, a children's picture book called The Man Who Walked Between the Towers. Why do we commemorate this? Because it's stupid? Okay, maybe a little bit. But no, it's because this man had mastered the art of balance. You know, church, balance is a really important thing, and it impresses us greatly because we recognize the risks of what Petit is doing on that wire. If he makes a misstep, if he loses his balance, he falls, and it spells certain doom for him. And when we lose our balance, the same is true. Now, we might not be 110 stories in the air, but our minor missteps, us losing our balance in our daily lives, can lead to the bigger errors that we face and eventually losing our way entirely. And in our church's vision, one of the things we emphasize a lot is balance. About a year ago, we launched a new vision for our church, which has just 4 words that compose everything we do at CrossPoint. Let's say those together to see how well we remember them, all right? What are they? Connect, grow, serve, and influence. That was much better than I thought. Give yourselves a hand. That was great. Give yourselves a hand for remembering 4 words we talked about a year ago. But those are the 4 things that we're about. It's what we aim to do as a church, both as individuals belonging to our church and as a collective body of faith. We connect. We participate in a local, like-minded community of faith. We grow. We allow God's love to flow into our mind, our being, and our strength. We serve. We allow God's love to overflow from ourselves to others through sacrifice. And finally, influence. We live out a response to God's love that impacts our neighbors. And in all of this, we seek to have a balance between connecting with our church and influencing the world around us. A balance between growing closer to Jesus and serving others on his behalf. All of these efforts are centered on accomplishing God's will and not our own. But sometimes it can be important for us to think about what being unbalanced in these ways might look like, so we can identify where we might need to make some adjustments. You know, when I'm driving in my car, I often don't notice when my wheels are out of alignment. I just think, yank the steering wheel back a little bit, it's fine, instead of addressing a larger problem that can harm my tires in the long run, that can lead to uneven wear and decreased tread life. And in the same way, it's helpful for us to know if we're out of alignment. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be exploring some characters in Scripture that are out of alignment, that are unbalanced. We're going to be taking a look at what it looks like to be unbalanced. And that's the title of this series that we're starting today. And if you're following along with your sermon notes on the Connect card or on Church Center, today's message is titled Isolated. We're going to be discussing what it looks like to not participate in a local, like-minded faith community by looking at the story of Lot in Genesis. Now, before we go any further, I want to address something vitally important about when we talk about the local church. I'm going to be talking a lot about how important it is and how life-giving it can be to be a part of those local faith communities like this one. I deeply believe that the local church is one of the most important things we can and should belong to as followers of Jesus. But those local church communities can sometimes be a point of pain and suffering for many who want to call it home, for many who want to call people their family. And I know there are many of us in this room that have experienced deep hurt from local churches when they have not acted like people following Jesus. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, church. I have never, ever been a part of a perfect church. And that includes this one. And I don't believe I ever will be. No church will ever be perfect because we are imperfect people. There's no escaping that fact. But while we might always be a part of an imperfect church, we can be a part of a church that points to the one who is perfect, because it is him that we follow. It is not our own way that we follow. So if we rely on him for strength, we can find perfection even in the imperfect world that we live in. I wanted to make very clear that as we began this morning. So as we look at Lot's story, we're going to focus on the 3 parts of Genesis where he is most active, and really 3 of the only mentions of him in the entire Bible. If you're unfamiliar with him, he is Abraham's nephew. And Lot and Abraham are coming up from the land of Egypt after heading there because of a famine in Canaan. They journeyed a long way from their former homeland. They find themselves in the Negev, which, if you're not familiar with Israeli geography, is a large stretch of desert in the southern parts of Israel. And as you might imagine, there are a couple of nomadic herdsmen tending to sheep and goats. And sheep and goats need water and vegetation. And they're in the middle of a desert where water and vegetation are very scarce. So some of their servants are getting into disputes and fights about where their flocks can graze. So Abraham decides to head off this conflict. He wants to put an end to it. He doesn't want to lose this relationship with a family member, one of the only ones he has in this part of the world after leaving his homeland of Ur. So he takes the high road. He acknowledges that peace between them might mean parting, and he tells Lot this in Genesis 13, verse 9. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, I will go to the left. Abraham is super generous here. He offers Lot his first choice of the land. He doesn't have to do this. He's the elder member of the family. He has the right to tell Lot where he needs to settle. But instead, he defers. Now, I want to make an important note here about the language we're seeing here. When we see the words left and right, if we're associating those with directions, what do we think those are? East and west, probably, right? Because we orient ourselves towards the north. But in ancient Israel, they didn't orient themselves towards the north. They oriented themselves towards the east, where the sun rises every morning. So when we read left and right, the language and the Hebrew words we're hearing there honestly read more as north and south. So Abraham is offering Lot a choice between going north towards Shechem, where they first arrived in the land of Canaan, or south towards Hebron, where they had just passed. So Abraham's saying, you go north, I'll go south. You go south, I'll go north. What does Lot do with this choice? Does he go north? Does he go south? Well, Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zor. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, lest they separated from each other. Lot, when offered the choice of north or south, takes a long look around. He doesn't see what he wants, so he broadens his horizons. He maybe looks west, towards the Mediterranean, towards the seacoast. He doesn't like what he sees there either. He doesn't want to build boats, so he looks east. And as he looks that way, he sees a lush valley where oases paint the barren desert with green vegetation due to the natural springs in the area that flow towards the Jordan. So naturally, he goes there. He leaves the land of Canaan because it looks so appealing. He sees the promise of prosperity in the river valley, and just like Eve does in Eden, he's attracted to the potential of what he sees, which is why that language of the garden of the Lord is there, to remind us of Eve seen the beauty in the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You see, church, Lot walks by sight. He doesn't walk by faith. He sees the means that can accomplish his ends of wealth and preserving his wealth for future generations, and he makes a self-gratifying choice. Now, none of that is inherently the problem here. It's not forbidden for us to make choices that help ourselves, and it's not forbidden for Lot to make that choice either. Here's the problem with Lot's choice. We see this in Genesis 13, starting at verse 12. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. Church, that's the problem with Lot's choice. It's not the split from Abraham or the need for more resources or even that Lot chooses what looks best. It's the new community he's going to surround himself with. He isn't just going towards the better pastures. While trying to live a godly life, he's immersing himself in a wicked, wicked place where it will take much effort to live in a holy way. If you're following along with your fill in the blanks this morning, church, here's your first one. Our selfish desires can overshadow our need for righteous community. Our selfish desires can overshadow our need for righteous community. You know, Lot's choice is really logical on the surface. Go where things look good. Then it'll go well for you. He wants to feel security in his future, and he acts accordingly. You know, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus is teaching when two brothers come up to him, and one yells to him, "Teacher, tell this man, my brother, to give me my share of my father's inheritance." And Jesus replies, not with a question as we might expect, but with a story as we would secondly expect. He tells them a parable in Luke 12, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Church, Jesus is saying here that building our lives around what we might get and what we might accumulate and what we hope for in the future is a bad idea, because what we have isn't going to last forever. You know, this parable illustrates a man making very normal decisions, but for very selfish reasons, not dissimilar from why Lot moves to Sodom in the first place. And Lot learns this lesson about idolizing potential very, very quickly in his dealings with Sodom, because in Genesis chapter 14, there is a group of kings, among whom is the king of Sodom. And the Bible tells us they're done paying this tribute to get this group of much more powerful kings off their back after 12 years of paying them resources out of their own coffers. So about a year after the cessation of the payment of the tribute, this group of 4 big, bad, powerful kings, led by Dan's favorite name in Genesis, Kedorlaomer. He loved saying that when we went through Abraham's life, so I figured he'd love hearing it again this morning. But these 4 kings decide to take some initiative. They decide, we don't like that you're not doing what we want, so we're going to go to war against you. The result, Genesis 14:10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen, or tar pits. Sounds sticky. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Church, do you think that's what Lot envisioned when he went to Sodom and saw the green pastures? I don't think it was. I don't think he envisioned a quick defeat and retreat of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other 3 that would leave him in danger. And that danger comes home to roost in the form of a plundering of the very city outside of which Lot has pitched his tent. You know, the king of Sodom, when he sees this more powerful enemy coming, when he sees what's happening to his army because of his rash and selfish decisions, He seems to know he and his allies, they're done for. So he and his army, among others, flee to the hills. And Lot is a victim of the fallout here. If he hadn't moved so close to Sodom, it's likely that he would have escaped the bulk of the harm that came to him. But now he and his entire household are in grave danger, being carried off by hostile forces. Why does this happen to Sodom? Well, church, I believe it's because the community of Sodom is weak. It's not just that they're writ large wicked, as mentioned in chapter 13, but they're selfish. They're not built on a firm foundation. Here's what we can learn from this church. Here's your next set of fill in the blanks this morning. Weak communities fall apart in hard times. Weak communities fall apart in hard times. I wonder if the city of Sodom was built on a foundation of greed and prosperity. It's easy to see how that could be the case. The land that they were on was green and lush, and they had life pretty easy. That's what drew Lot in, how viable the area looked for an easy life for him and his flocks. Church, that temptation of more is so easy for us to fall prey to. And when more comes our way, like we see in Lot's story, there's no guarantee of it lasting for forever, yet we often rely on it like it is. But that's not where Lot's story with Sodom ends. In verse 13 of the same chapter, it says, "Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner." These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan, the far northern reaches of Israel. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus, all the way north of Israel and Syria. Then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and all the women and the people. Abraham goes after Lot, even though he's not with him anymore, because the bonds they share go beyond just convenience or proximity. It's because Abram loves his nephew, who was like a son to him at a time when he had no son of his own and would do anything for him, even if it might involve some sacrifice on his part. Church, here's your next set of fill in the blanks this morning, what we can learn from Abraham here. Christ-like community provides support and intervention in times of crisis. Christ-like community provides support and intervention in times of crisis. We have heard this time and time again. And we've heard this very recently, actually, of these stories of renewal we were talking about in our last series over the past month or so, how incarnate, embodied, local Christian communities have a direct impact on our lives. We heard from Larry Drake last week that there were times when God changed him dramatically, directly through these awesome transcendent experiences he had at the birth of his daughter and at his daughter's baptism. But when he was in a time of crisis, it was his Christ-like community that intervened on God's behalf and carried him through his path of addiction. And similarly, JJ, just a couple weeks ago, mentioned how counseling and mentoring from people in his faith communities enabled him and his wife, Lori, to chart a new, healthier course for their marriage. When Jack Ford spoke a few weeks ago, he needed a Christ-centered approach with Celebrate Recovery to show not just that alcohol was a harmful source for his life, but that Jesus was the best source for his life. And Dan's daughter, Grace, in the first story we heard, needed people to show her light in times of darkness, despair, and depression. Because, church, we don't often know the impact our community can have on us until we ourselves need it, and they show up. And if we withhold ourselves from engaging in Christ-like community, there's a chance that we're limiting our ability to do God's work through us. Now, on the flip side, when we engage with the wrong communities, we can go down with the ship. In Genesis chapter 18, we see God telling Abraham that the state of the city of Sodom is horrific. In verse 20, the Lord said to Abram, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." Now, so far in the book of Genesis, Sodom's wickedness has been described in these abstract and vague terms. They're just wicked. They're very wicked. But when we see this word outcry in these verses of what's going up to God, there's a particular slant that word is going for that narrows the picture of Sodom's sin at least a little bit for us before we see it in full in the next chapter. The Hebrew word used here is se'akah, and it's the same word that's used in Exodus chapter 3 to describe the way the Israelites are crying out in their slavery to Egypt up to God when God tells Moses at the burning bush, "I have heard the cries of my people." And there's a lot of other places when it's used when people are crying out to God in a situation of oppression. It's used very commonly in that sense in the Old Testament. And to me, this shows that the sin that God is responding to in Sodom, it's some kind of exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. And other references to Sodom, particularly in the prophets, back that up. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 16. When God is using Israel as a metaphor, when God is using Sodom as a metaphor for Israel, lest we think that God's chosen people can't do some really wicked things, God tells them, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." You know, we've already seen the possibility, church, that Sodom idolizes prosperity. But the picture's becoming much, much clearer now. This city is a place where power is idolized above all else, and the power of its own citizens is prioritized and elevated and left to run all over all others. And once these angelic visitors that God has sent to scout out the state of the sin of the city come into Lot's home, they encounter a bit of a welcoming committee that might reveal more about what Sodom's sin manifests as, their sin of selfishness and haughtiness. It says in Genesis 19, starting at verse 4, "Before Lot and these two visitors lay down to sleep, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them.'" We see here how depraved Sodom is in their perversion and unrestraint. The entire male population of the city gathers outside Lot's door, demanding to forcibly take advantage of these two visitors. And based on the fact that they're all there, and this seems to have more than just an impulsiveness to it, I'm going to venture to say, church, though this isn't in Scripture, this might not be the first door they've gathered around, trying to attempt this exact same thing. This seems to be a routine part of the city life. Now, Lot doesn't know that his visitors are heavenly in nature, but he attempts to make a compromise with those threatening them. That might seem good on the surface, but quickly reveals the compromise that has already occurred within himself. In verse 7, Lot says, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." I guess I can give Lot some credit for defending the stranger, unlike those in the city, but in exchange, he does the unthinkable. He offers his own daughters as a substitute for these men to the angry mob. Instead of correcting their unholiness, he's merely redirecting it. And church, it's my belief that in some sense, the way in which he's doing this, the redirection, is worse than what the men at his door were asking for in the first place because of what he's doing to his role as a father. You know, Andrew Steinman in his commentary on Genesis described Lot's response this way. He said, "It would seem that Lot, who addressed the crowd as 'my brothers,' was more concerned with identifying with the city than with fulfilling his vocation as father. He's abdicating one very important role for the sake of a lesser one. He's attempting to placate his city at the expense of his family." And Alan Ross, in his commentary on Genesis, put that same truth this way: Sodom would have destroyed Lot if the Lord had not destroyed Sodom. And it's pretty clear to me from what's happening in this story that Sodom has actually already destroyed Lot from the inside. He has succumbed to the culture of his city because he's being influenced and not being an influence. Here's your next set of fill in the blanks this morning, church. Real simple. We become who we're around. We become who we're around. It's that simple. In the context of our church vision, that's why being a part of a local, like-minded community of faith is important. Because when we aren't, we become like what we're around. And when we're not around Jesus or others that follow him, we can't become more like Jesus. It's not a hard equation to solve. In church, I struggle with this deeply. For me, being disconnected and isolated from Jesus doesn't look like me not going to church or being around church life. I'm kind of paid to be here. For me, this is a lot tougher. It looks like me not engaging with my faith sometimes, the other 6 days of the week, besides how it brings me into the office every morning. Because when I'm not following the way of Jesus by engaging in Christ-like habits, I notice the effect that their absence has on me. When I'm less present with Jesus daily than I am with my news feeds and my comment sections, swiping around because it feels good in the moment, because it feels like I'm getting some kind of satisfaction even though I'm getting nothing, in the long run, I become rushed and hurried, anxious, tired. Because when I'm not aware of what I'm doing and mindlessly scrolling and mindlessly walking about this world, I don't feel closer to Jesus. I feel even further away from him. I'm not that old yet, despite the pain in my neck some mornings when I wake up because of my sad pillows. But the more and more I live, the more and more I've begun to realize the wages of me separating myself from God, or as Paul describes it in Romans 6:23, my sin, wages are death. And that's not because God is paying out death to me when I'm separate from him. It's because I'm getting what I'm asking for. It's because when I separate myself from Jesus, I'm removing myself from the only true source of life in this universe. And when I'm not participating in my faith day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice, I become lost in my own head and my own worries instead of abiding in the arms and the love and comfort of my Savior. As Eugene Peterson put it, the Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life. Any one of those things missing, and we will change for the worse. But that's not where the impact of this change stops. What makes this reality so important to grasp is that the impact of our personal community doesn't just stay personal. In Lot's story, his corrupted character spreads around to his wife, who disobeys an explicit warning from one of these angels to not look back at the burning city as they're escaping. When she turns around, she turns to a pillar of salt. She longed for this city. And just like in Lot's willingness to give up his daughters to the mob, the way the city has deeply affected her mind, being, and strength shows up in tragic ways. And then there's Lot's daughters, who at the end of this same chapter take advantage of their drunk father to preserve their family line, showing the exact same behavior as the depraved men of the city. Here's what we can learn from this church. Here's your last set of fill-in-the-blanks this morning. Our community impacts our legacy. Our community impacts our legacy. You see, Lot was so influenced by Sodom, by their wickedness, and so was his family. Because our own influences, they have a ripple effect that go out to others we do life with. That's why the communities we place ourselves in are so vital to who we are, church. They don't just affect us, but also all those that we love. They don't just change who we're becoming, but they change who they're becoming too. So as we close today, church, I want us to think about this very simple question. Who are you becoming? What is your environment that you spend your time in doing to your ability and readiness to follow Jesus? Is it helping? Hurting? A little bit of both? Is the way that you're engaging with your faith in your church limited to just the time you're here on Sunday morning, filling in your blanks, singing some songs, grabbing your coffee and donut. Maybe you add your life group in there on Wednesday. But otherwise, you're not engaging with life with Jesus. Church, being a part of a community of faith, connecting with Jesus, those aren't just boxes to check throughout our week. These are ways to live. Because Jesus wants us to become more like him. So church, who are you becoming?